become a great speaker. And oh, you need are
I need the cable.
cable.
No, the cable itself.
Cable.
Great.
Wait. Coming. It's coming. Yeah, adjusting. Okay.
Great. Okay.
Go ahead.
Whoa. Whoa. I am the ghost of testing past. Let me demonstrate. Whoops. Okay, let me test the addition operation. 2 plus 2. Yes, it works. I call this testing past, but to this day, many people earn a living by clicking on a GUI and watching what happens. Whoa. Whoa. Not for me, the manual labor of running tests and inspecting results. No, I have a computer. I have automated my tests with a testing library. All I have to do is compile my code. Here I perform my test. I compare against the expected result. Let's compile my test code and run the tests. Yes, no. When my tests fail, all the tests are run. When a test fails, the location is reported, and I see exactly what the problem is. I expected 6, but I got 5. And so I will fix the test in the classic manner by changing the expected result to match the actual one. My tests pass. Whoa. Whoa. I am the ghost of testing future. Not for me, the manual labor of inventing individual test cases. No. I simply write, whoops. Darn, hit the wrong key. I simply write general properties of my code, and I leave it to a tool to invent the test cases. Let me compile the future test code and simply invoke my tool and give it a property as argument. Yes, plus is commutative. 101 tests say so. Yes, plus is associative. Oh, no it isn't. If you take 1/6, 1, and 1 as floating point numbers, it's not associative. And immediately, the interesting test case is presented to me in the simplest possible form, ready for me to diagnose the problem. Ooh. Okay. So what was all that? That, minus hitting the wrong key, was the first couple of minutes of a talk I gave a couple of years ago at a symposium called The Future of Programming. And so my talk was called The Future of Testing, and I gave it in early January, hence the references to Christmas and Dickens' story. So why did I start that way? Well, partly because it let me start with an example. I could be very concrete, and I could show you exactly what I'm talking about. And that's one thing that's important to remember, to resist the temptation to be abstract and general, but be very concrete and use examples. It let me run a demo of QuickCheck, albeit a very simple one, but demos are also a very good way to introduce your problem. Kenichi gave you a very good demo at the start of his talk for similar reasons. And finally, I surprised you. You weren't expecting a ghost to come up from behind the podium. And that's part of putting on a show. And a presentation of a research paper is very much a show. Now, maybe you're thinking, this is science. I shouldn't have to put on a show. But I'm afraid you do. If you sit at the back and you look at what's on people's screens, you'll see email, Facebook, the newspaper. Some people are taking the opportunity to do a little bit of hacking. So that's what you have to compete with. And if you don't grab the audience's attention in the first couple of minutes, then you've lost them for the whole talk. So I want you to think of a research presentation as a performance. And that's liberating in a way, because it means even if privately you're a shy, retiring person, it doesn't matter. Up here, you are the star, and your job is to perform. So act as the charismatic speaker. Don't be afraid to go over the top. So many good speakers do things which are really quite outrageous. Earlier on today, you saw Phil Wadler strip off his shirt in front of you all, and he had a lambda on it. Quite often he has the most important inference rule of his talk, or a commuting diagram. Does he take his shirt off because you can see the diagram better on his chest than on the screen? Of course not. He does it for shock value, because you can't quite believe a distinguished professor is stripping off in front of you. And that keeps the audience's attention. So it's quite okay to do that kind of thing. It's very, very unlikely that you will go too far over the top. It's much more likely that you'll be too withdrawn instead. Talk to the audience. Look them in the eye. Don't talk at them. And a very good way to engage the audience is something else that Phil did, to ask the audience questions. I often speak to audiences of software developers from industry. And I like to start my talks with a question. Let me try the question out on you. Who really, really loves testing? Okay, four people. Well, you'll be glad to know that you're not really alone in that. I get rather similar responses from industrial software developers. Make of that what you will. And that gives me a chance to say, I didn't used to enjoy testing either, before I started using QuickCheck. So that's quite good. Any question you ask the audience, of course, it should be easy to answer, and you should know which answer you're going to get. But it's an effective technique for keeping people engaged. Okay, so that was the fun part. Come back. Now let's get serious. Here's the outline of my talk. First of all, we'll have the introduction. We just had that. Then I'm going to introduce the problem that I'm addressing. I'll show you my solution, present my results, and then I'll discuss them and some related work. And finally, I will conclude. Did you learn anything from that? Of course not. What I did was I just wasted 1 minute of my precious 30. And I've seen people waste a lot more than 1 minute on the outline slide. For example, you might try to explain what each of these parts is going to be. But it's pointless. Why is it pointless? Because at this point, the audience doesn't understand your problem, are not prepared to understand your solution, and you can't say enough to the outline slide to explain that stuff. That's what the rest of your talk is for. So an outline slide is almost always a waste of time. Don't present it. I suspect you will see many of them this week. And I'd like you, every time you do, to ask yourself, Was that time well spent? And I suspect you will agree with me very often that it was not. So again, I'm emphasizing time here. When you first give a talk, 30 minutes, if that's the time you have, may seem like an ocean of time. How are you going to fill it? It's not. It's very, very short. And in order to fit your talk within the time, you have to be very, very focused, and you have to throw away a lot of material. So if you're presenting a paper, there will be many great ideas in the paper that you worked hard on for a long time that you do not have time to present. You must focus. And something else that you can consider removing, although not everybody agrees about this, is the related work slide. So if you would include a related work slide with 4 or 5 papers on it and say one sentence about each one, then nobody will learn anything from that. If you can talk for 5 minutes and explain in detail the relationship to related work, that's another matter. But if all you're going to do is the laundry list, then, well, that's suitable for your paper, but it's a waste of time in a talk. So, you've got to be focused. That means you have to know what you're trying to achieve with your talk. And you are not trying to explain your paper in depth. It's just not possible in the time you have available. So what are you trying to do? You are selling. You're trying to sell your paper to the audience. If the audience goes out of your talk thinking, that sounds interesting, I must read the paper, then you've won. That's your goal. So we're talking about selling to the audience. Let's just ask, who is your audience? Well, I mean, that may seem obvious. Here they are in front of you. But an audience is a very mixed group of people. Don't make the mistake of trying to show the experts in the audience how clever you are. You see that from time to time. If you do, you'll be talking to 3 people, and the other 97, you're wasting their time. So please don't do that. Aim your talk at the least well-informed people in the audience. And explain too much rather than too little. And if you do that, you know what? The experts will love your talk too. They will admire the clarity of your exposition. Who knows, they might borrow some of it for their next talk. Quite a useful thing to ask yourself when you're trying to figure out this focus is, if the audience is going to remember only one thing from your talk, what should it be? And then make sure that your talk actually emphasizes that. It's much better to explain one interesting thing well so that people go away thinking, that was interesting, I want to know more, than to try to explain many interesting things superficially because people will just tune out. Okay, so your problem. The first thing that you have to do in a talk is show the audience what your problem is. How should you do that? The best way is to show an example. And so you've seen examples of this today. When I started my talk at Future of Programming, I began with an example. When I started my talk at PLMW, I began with an example. So please use that to introduce your problem. But it's not enough just to show the audience what your problem is. You also have to show them why they should care about it. So I mentioned that we are trying to sell our work in a talk. So maybe we can take some ideas from sales techniques. This is a book which, if you're interested, you might like to read. It's a Bible of modern sales techniques for complex sales. And there's not much more complex a sale than a research idea. You can see it's called spin selling. It's an acronym. The P stands for problem. So you have to establish that the customer, the intended customer, has a problem. But that's not enough, because you may explain your problem to the customer, and the customer may be thinking, yes, I suppose it's a problem, but it's not costing me very much. It's not very important. I've got other things that I should be spending my time on. So to sell successfully, the next thing you have to do is to show the implication of the problem. What is it going to cost the customer? Here's an example from my Future of Testing talk. This is about a bug that QuickCheck found in a CAN bus stack from automotive software. So the CAN bus, it's a network that you find in cars. And this slide illustrates a test case where we send 3 messages with 3 different priorities, one being the highest. When message 1 is sent, it goes immediately onto the bus because the bus was free. And then at the end of the test case, the bus confirms transmission of message 1. The other 2 have been queued up, and so the protocol stack must send the next message, which should be the one with priority 2. But actually, the software we were testing sent the one with priority 3. Okay, it's a bug. It's not conformant with the specification of a CAN bus. But does it matter? It's just a little bit of priority inversion between messages. Well, those priorities are there for a reason. Everything in the car talks on the CAN bus. The stereo, the brakes. Here's a tip. Don't adjust the volume during emergency braking. You see what I did? I turned a small technical problem in a test case into a matter of life or death. That's implication. Don't forget to do it. Okay, so of course a very important part of your talk is like this, your slides. Let's talk about slides for a little. Have you seen ones like this? Or this? Or this? Yeah, perhaps you'll see 1 or 2 of these this week. It's amazing how often, when somebody puts up a slide like this, that the next thing they say is, this rule is the one I want you to read. The rest are standard. If that's the rule you want the audience to read, that is the only rule that should be on the slide. So this is a very important lesson. Everything you put on a slide that you do not intend the audience to read serves only to distract them from what you're saying. So don't do it. I minimize what goes onto my slides very much. And while we're talking about slides, here's another question for the audience. In the back row, who can easily read that? Okay. Simon can, Kathleen can, and a couple of others, but most people can't. I thought I might get a better result in this room because we have a particularly large screen here. The problem in this room, if you're sitting at the back, is that you can't see the bottom quarter of the screen. So 2 things. One thing is, if you know a large part of your audience can't see the bottom bit of the screen, don't put anything important there. But secondly, what about this, this font size there? That is 18 point. It's the default font size in PowerPoint. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, Microsoft. Keynote is every bit as bad, and SlideTech is even worse. These presentation tools that we use for conference talks, they're designed for giving talks to a small number of people in a small room. In that case, 18-point font is quite all right. But when you speak in a large room like this one, and many of your audience are far away from the screen, it's illegible. I try, if I can, I avoid using anything smaller than 24 point, so a third again as large as that, and certainly never this size. And this is the most common mistake that people make. I think at Popple this year, it was maybe almost half the speakers used a font size that was not legible from the rear half of the room. And if you're going to do that, what's the point of giving the talk? Half the people there cannot follow what you're saying. So when you make fonts, when you make text that is actually large enough, it looks huge on your laptop screen, but do it anyway. It's absolutely necessary. Let me show you a few more slides. These come from a keynote that I gave at ICFP quite a few years ago. This is the estimated cost to the US economy per year of software errors. It's a lot of money, $200 per man, woman, and child in the US. But let's put that figure into perspective. This is an estimate of the turnover of the software industry in the US around about the same time, $240 billion. Okay, so that's turnover. How much of a software company's income do they spend on development? Back of the envelope here. Let's guess half. So maybe 120 billion was being spent on software development in the US every year. This is a common estimate for the proportion of cost of software that is spent on testing. So what does that leave as the money spent on testing per year? Roughly $60 billion. So the money that the software industry spent on testing is roughly the same as the cost to society of the remaining software errors, which is probably about right, isn't it? Certainly it tells us as researchers that if we want to propose techniques for reducing the remaining errors, they better not cost more than twice as much as testing. Otherwise, it would actually be worse for society to use them. So that's kind of interesting. That's how I presented it at ICFP. I hope you'll agree my font was legible at the back. Here's how I could have presented it, of course. But it would have had very much less impact. Now, many people will write slides like this, and I think it's partly because if you're inexperienced as a speaker, you want to remember what you're going to say. And so you tend to write it on the slides and use the slides as a teleprompter. Don't do that. Don't plan to read your slides to the audience. Plan to talk about them to the audience. Oh, by the way, there's yet another way I could have presented this. Software errors cost the US economy $60 billion a year. The turnover of the software industry is around $240 billion a year. Are you annoyed yet? It's infuriating, isn't it? Don't do this. That really uses animation to emphasize the medium and not the message. You will see people do it, though, but it's really a bad idea. If you want to use animation, animations can be very good. I use them a lot. But not to do this. Use animations to show the difference between two slides or to call attention to something. Here's another slide from the ICFP keynote. This is about a bug we found in a 3G radio base station, which was the generation at the time. So that's a radio base station in the middle. It's talking to handsets. And while a handset is active, then it's got a radio channel back to the base station. But generally speaking, there are too many handsets in a cell for all of them to have a channel active all of the time. And so there's another channel, a signaling channel, so-called, that goes to all of the phones and can be used for common messages. There's only one of these things, but it still has to be set up. Now, the base station is controlled by a separate radio network controller, and that will send a message saying, set up your signaling channel. That'll specify the frequency, the power, various parameters, and so on. And the base station is supposed to say, OK, I've done that. Great. But remember, there should only be one of these things. So the radio network controller should never send another message saying, set it up again. But if it does, then the base station should just say, no, I'm not doing that. Well, we discovered that the base station we were testing said no, almost always. But for just the right combination of parameters, which QuickCheck found, it could be induced to say yes. And now you've got two signaling channels at the same time. You've broken a fundamental invariant of the base station software. And within a second, the entire thing crashed. The only way to use it again was to reboot it, which was a 2-minute process. I can tell you, this was not easy to debug because of that. It was really quite a serious crash. So what did you see there? You saw animation being used to draw your attention to the thing I was talking about at each point. And that's a good use of animation. If you wanted to do it differently, you could, of course, stand here and just point with your arm. Pointing with your arm is useful if you can't reach. There's nothing wrong with jumping. It keeps the audience awake. I don't recommend using a laser pointer. They're very hard to aim correctly. They're very hard to hold steady. What tends to happen is that a red dot appears, bounces around the screen a bit, and the audience doesn't know what they're supposed to look at. So I would say use your arm, jump if need be. If you have a big stick, nothing wrong with a big stick. But if the screen is too large, as it sometimes is for you to reach the top, even with a big stick, then animate instead. The good thing about animation is it works no matter what. Well, you saw Phil do that today. I would generally prefer animations because they're a bit more visible than a mouse movement. Also, something you have to watch is with some slide viewers, when you move the mouse, some backwards and forwards things can appear down here. And if those things come and go, they can be distracting. So you don't want those. Okay. How are we doing? Okay. So, let's see. So what about nerves? So I can't honestly claim to get nervous about giving talks anymore. I did when I was younger, but I've done it so much that I don't really get nerves. Perhaps you will. I do get a lot of adrenaline, though. And adrenaline is good. You should be moving around, pointing at the screen. You're passionate about your work, right? Let the audience see your excitement. It's appealing. So make use of that. Remember that what you're doing is a performance. The fact that you feel nervous doesn't mean you should act nervous. Acting nervous is never good. And it can be helpful to have a script. I have one here. If you have a script, then don't write down everything you plan to say. Let's see. Do not write down everything that you plan to say. It just wouldn't work. So what you want is bullet points in a large font that you can glance at just to remind yourself, where am I? What do I mean to say next? And then you'll be improvising much of the time, but the script can help you keep track of where you are in your presentation. And especially if you follow my advice and you don't put much on your slides, then it can be a support to know that you have a script. Do plan parts of your talk in complete detail. I think it's a good idea to plan maybe the first 1 or 2 minutes at such a level of detail that you know exactly which words you're going to say, because that 2 minutes is incredibly important for capturing the audience's attention. Likewise, the end of your talk, you want to know exactly what you're going to say, so it's worthwhile planning that in complete detail. Otherwise, maybe 1 or 2 key phrases that you might use during the talk. I have an example of that too. This came from a couple of years ago. Colleagues of mine had a paper at ICFP, but were not able to travel. So I ended up having to give the talk. They made the slides for me, but I had to present them. It was a lovely talk about parallel parsing. And here's an example of parsing a sequence of Ys. It turns out that a sequence of things is the hardest thing to parse in parallel, because the syntax tree that you would naturally build would be a linked list. And that's a very sequential data structure. You can't build it in parallel. So the key idea here was, instead of building a linked list, parse it into a balanced binary tree, where you could just combine the subsequences in pairs to get a data structure that can be built in parallel. But if you think about it, that's very tough, because at this stage, how do you know, before you've parsed the input, which of those Ys you should combine into nodes at the next level? So, in fact, probably the biggest technical contribution of that paper is solving this problem, figuring out how to do it. But I knew that I would get to this slide with only maybe 30 seconds to spare. I could spend less time explaining it than I've spent explaining it to you now. And yet I wanted people to know that there was something here. So I said, this looks easy. It's not. Read the paper. And that was a memorable phrase. I know, because people talked to me about it afterwards. It's not a phrase that I made up on the spot. It's a phrase that was planned and was in my notes. So having some such phrases pre-planned is a good idea, especially if you're speaking in a language that is not your native language. Then you might want to pre-plan in a bit more detail. When I give technical talks in Swedish, I have more complete plans than when I give them in English. That's because I live in Sweden, but my native language is English, by the way. So the other thing to do is to rehearse your talk. again and again and again. If you've rehearsed it enough times, then there's no need to be nervous. When I gave my Future of Testing talk, my laptop began to install Windows 8.1 in the middle of it. But I had practiced the talk enough times that I was able to finish it on the whiteboard. So it was not as much a disaster as you might have expected. Okay, so I know I said that you should think about if there's one thing that people should remember from your talk, then you should know what it is. I'm sorry, I've let you down. I have 3 things you should remember. They are: be concrete, use examples to make your points, don't put too much on your slides, and put on a good show. And if you do those 3 things, then I will look forward to listening to you speak in the future. Thank you.
Questions?
It's a little bit more like a musician because I gave a talk last year and I had a great insight of using the same colors as my text editor, and there were lights at the front and I had very dark colors and the operators completely blotted out. So if you want to save yourself from, well, the situation that you have to read out your operators aloud to the audience, do yourself a favor, use light background like you did. It's a lot better for the audience.
Absolutely, yes. Colored characters on a black background, they're a disaster.
Other question?
Think about colors in general, because I mean there are colorblind people, and so
Yeah, that's true.
Do you have any techniques you use for rehearsing? Like, do you just go through the entire talk, or do you focus on one piece at a time?
I go through the entire talk. I give the talk to myself, sitting at my laptop, and I time it. And I make a note of how long it took to get to various points in the talk. So one of the things that you will often have to do is adjust the content of a talk depending on how long the time takes. So to begin with, when I time a talk, it starts off too long. All talks do. It is much better to know that and to plan how you're going to cut it in advance than it is to cut it because the chairman says, I'm sorry, we have to go to lunch. So that's important. But also, I like to include things like demos in my talk. The thing about demos is that it's unpredictable how long they're going to take, especially if you get a question during them, which is great. So if you have a demo in the talk in particular, then you need to have planned parts of the talk that you can cut out without the audience noticing. Did you notice the parts I cut out? I cut out 1 or 2 bits today. And knowing the timing is helpful for that. Right, and so as I give the talk to myself, I'm always recording these times, making notes and planning how to cope with various things that might happen as I actually give it.
How do you recommend showing the code?
Showing code? Yes. So I showed code today in Emacs, which I quite like to do, but I don't know if you noticed, something else about demos is that the fonts that Emacs uses by default are far too small for the screen. So that's, oh, you saw me, I had to restart Emacs. And I set it to a 20-point font size. Ah. And I know why you can't see it. It's because I forgot to quit PowerPoint. Yeah. So you have to enlarge the fonts. And that typically means that you need to lay out the source code differently so that it will fit on the screen. If you're going to do a demo, make sure you do it with the resolution set to 1024 by 768. I watched one guy trying to demo something with a GUI where the button he had to click was off the right-hand side of the screen, and there was no way to bring it back on. You don't want that to happen during your demo. So make sure you practice the demo with fonts enlarged, make sure everything fits on the screen.
Any advice if you have to give a talk or a lecture without presentations? I mean, with Blackboard as in your time?
What piece of advice is it? Always
let me repeat that good advice, which is that quite often a question is inaudible from the back of the room, so it's very useful if the speaker remembers to repeat the question before answering it. And the question here was, do I have advice for giving a talk without visual aids? That is, without the screen. Well, I think that is a very different kind of talk. I would be thinking about, can I use props during the talk instead of visual aids? For example, I used to lecture first-year students on introductory programming, and I would talk about divide and conquer at one point. And the example I used was searching a binary tree. And I was teaching them Haskell, and one of the hard things about teaching insertion into a binary tree in Haskell is that people forget to reassemble the tree after traversing it and changing the right point. So I would teach that by taking a phone book. This is how long ago that was. I had a phone book with all the phone numbers in Gothenburg. And I would say, right, I want to change my phone number. And then I would open it at random in the middle, look at the name, see was it before or after mine. And then I'd rip the phone book in half, which is quite easy if you rip down the spine, actually. It doesn't take a lot of strength. But it looks good. And then I would take the half containing my name, open that in the middle at a random place, do the same thing, until, even given the number of pages in the phone book, the log is fairly small. So before long, I would have a single piece of paper, and I would write my name, write the new phone number by my name, and I would hold it up, surrounded with bits of phone book. And I would say, have I finished? And they would say, no, put the phone book back together. And my point was made. So, yeah, I would think of that kind of thing.
What's your opinion on interacting with the audience?
On interacting with the audience. So I think it's a very good thing. I mean, that you want your audience to be awake. If your audience is asking questions, then that's positive. Quite often, so in a talk that I've given many times to industry developers, I present a test that shows a bug. Then I ask the audience to suggest corrections for the bug. And I have an example where there's an obvious correction that does the wrong thing. And so I think it works very well to get somebody in the audience to suggest what looks like a reasonable solution, and then I'll implement it, and then I'll show it still doesn't work. So I like doing that. If you get a question that you cannot answer quickly, so it's going to disrupt your talk, then you just say, can I come back to that at the end? So you're still in control, even if the audience is asking questions. But you can get something very positive out of it.
Thank you.
So before closing the workshop, I'd like to announce about the dinner, and